Hello and welcome back for those of you who have been following us for the past 2 days. This is day 3 of the State of the World 2021 conference brought to you by Florida International University and its Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in partnership with the McKean Institute, part of Arizona State University. And we have another full day here today with lots going on right up until late this afternoon. And we have a terrific panel to kick us off here this morning. This first panel is a partnership between U.S. Southern Command and the Jack Gordon Institute here at part of the Green School at FIU. And this represents a longstanding partnership between Southcom and FIU. And we're very grateful to our friends and partners over at U.S. Southern Command for a topic that is very important. It is IUU fishing, part of an IUU fishing conference, which is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And this panel this morning will talk about the global implications of illegal fishing. And of course, I think it goes without saying that the way governments and regimes treat their own people is indicative of how they'll treat other countries and concepts of sovereignty, territorial integrity, but also rules of the road and rules of the sea. And I think we'll see in this discussion today that some of these regimes that don't respect human rights of their own people don't respect the rules and laws of other kinds of commerce and activity. So we are going to kick off this morning with some opening remarks by Admiral Craig Fowler, who is commander of U.S. Southern Command. He's a 1983 graduate of U.S. Naval Academy and has held a number of distinguished positions, which you can find in the bios of the program. Admiral Fowler has been with us before, and we're delighted to welcome him back. After his opening comments, I'm going to turn the floor over to my very good friend, Luis Guillermo Solis, who is former president of Costa Rica from 2014 to 2018, and currently the interim director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, part of the Green School here at FIU. But first, Admiral Fowler, if I may, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you and good morning. I'd like to start by thanking Florida International University for their partnership and for the important work they do on global and hemispheric security issues. We've had the privilege and honor of working with them on a number of really critical topics here at Southcom and pulling together top thinkers, thought leaders on these subjects is so important. So again, we have another one of these really important discussions teed up today, and thank you, FIU. President Solis, thank you for your leadership of this as well, and for being a big part of the moderation today. Admiral Schultz, your participation, and Ambassador Maines, our civilian deputy commander here at headquarters, and all the other distinguished panelists and folks that will be presenting today. Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is a national security issue, and I applaud the United States Coast Guard for the recent strategy that they wrote of how the Coast Guard, on behalf of the U.S. government, will take the U.S. government lead under Department of Homeland Security on this. When we sit with defense leaders here in the hemisphere, and Ambassador Maines and I travel together, and we've continued to travel together despite the pandemic. When we sit with these leaders, this issue, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, is in the top 3 threats that are raised by our counterparts consistently for all the coastal nations. And it's an issue that affects their food security and their national security and impacts the United States. And it's an issue that's so important globally and in this hemisphere. Here in this hemisphere, which we describe at Southcom as our neighborhood, the proximity to the United States matters. And so insecurity to our partner nations has a disproportionate negative effect on the United States. And flip that around, it's in all our best interest to ensure and secure hemispheric security. And this is an important aspect of that. That proximity is so important. And the people, the values that we share, you mentioned it up front in your introduction, are so critical to solving these problems. And when we have shared values of democracy, freedom, rule of law, freedom of speech, the human rights, we share that, the importance of all those things that we share together here in the hemisphere, it provides a really solid foundation for solving some of these problems. And as I know will be pointed out in the panel discussions, some of the principal nation states involved in the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, IUU, don't share those values. And state-sponsored enterprises are clearly behind this insecurity, this food insecurity, and its impact. So the people, the proximity, the resources. This is a resource-rich hemisphere. And think about water and arable land and soybeans and crops and cattle. And then think about resources that we have in the extraction world: oil, gas, lithium, bauxite, and the list goes on. This is a resource-rich hemisphere, and those resources should provide and can provide for the common good as we look forward. Unfortunately, resources that are often at the heart of the insecurity. We see this with fish, and we see it with oil in Venezuela and how it's been misused by the Maduro regime to their advantage and not the advantage of the people. The economic impacts that food insecurity, that insecurity in this region has on the United States and globally are extreme. And so we have to get that right as we look at the hemisphere as the second largest trading bloc here in the United States. So economics matter. In so many ways, this hemisphere matters. And in some cases, we have to ask ourselves, do we pay the right attention to hemispheric security issues as a backbone of our overall US national security and as the bulwark for global security? We're going to get at a really important aspect to that today. Ambassador Maines and I recently returned from a trip to Guyana. Guyana has a large disputed border region with Venezuela. They also have extremely large oil reserves that are being actively pursued by a number of international and multinational corporations. Guyana has been the victim of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. During a press conference, I was asked a question by a Guyanese reporter. Can you talk about who the principal nation state or supporter of the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing in Guyanese waters is? And I deferred that to my host because it's their issue. I was on the podium with the Guyanese Defense Force. But I did say we have clear examples in other parts of the hemisphere, Ecuador, Peru, where Chinese state-sponsored fishing fleets would, for large portions of the day, turn off their AIS, their transponders that are mandated by international law for significant periods of time, up to 8 hours. There's only two reasons you do that. It's because the equipment is broken or because you're trying to mask some illicit behavior. So turning these things off for significant periods of the day in concert with hundreds of other vessels does not constitute equipment malfunction. Within minutes of stating this fact that Chinese had incurred into Ecuadorian waters for illegal fishing, I immediately, there was a Chinese state-sponsored press release saying that the commander of the United States Southern Command was speaking incorrectly and that China was the principal supporter of international law globally, to include environmental law. So we'll let the facts speak for themselves. This is a national security threat to the United States and our host nations, and it is something that collectively we will need to work together to solve. We are stronger when we work together, and I applaud FIU's efforts to bring us together today to have a clear conversation about how we can meet these challenges together as a global community. So I look forward to the discussion, and thank you again for everyone who's participating today.
Thank you very much, Admiral Fowler, for your presentation this morning, for your powerful remarks. And it is my pleasure now to introduce the rest of the panelists for today's discussion. As it has been mentioned, this is a very fundamental issue in our regional agenda, and therefore we're very glad here at FIU to be able to discuss this with people who have been dealing with for a long, long time, with decision makers, analysts, and as you will see, individuals who have devoted a lot of their time, a lot of their reflection to this issue. I would like to remind you that you should share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag at IUUFCON 2021, hashtag IUUFCon 2021. Translation for this panel is available in Spanish and Portuguese. Please click on the interpretation icon to choose the language you prefer. And you're also welcome to view the stream on Facebook, but note that it will not be translated. Allow me to remind you as well that you can share your questions through the Q&A icon, and I will be mixing your questions as we go on in our discussions, which I hope will look also a bit like a conversation between the audience and the panelists. Today, we have three distinguished panelists joining us. I would like to present Admiral Carl Schultz, who is the 26th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. He oversees all Coast Guard operations and about 80,000 active duty reserve, civilian, and volunteer personnel. Ambassador Jean E. Maines, who is the civilian deputy to the commander and foreign policy advisor at U.S. Southern Command. She is responsible for overseeing the development and refinement of U.S. Southcom's regional strategy and security cooperation plans. And journalist Ian Urbina, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter and best-selling author of The Outlaw Ocean. These are our most distinguished panelists today. I thank them for being here, and I thank you all for joining in this spectacular session on one of our region's most pressing issues: illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. What we're going to do now is give the floor to each of our panelists to frame their remarks, and after that we'll throw in some questions and start the discussion right away. So without further ado, Ambassador Jean E. Maines, the floor is yours, madam.
Great, thank you, President Solis, and a big hello to everybody online and to my fellow panelists. Today is a very exciting day because we're here to talk about a global issue, and we're going to focus on results. And so that many of the people on the screen are very involved in the specific results of how you counter illegal fishing and then the way forward. So why are we even talking about this? It is a global issue, and it affects a whole range of things, from food sustainability to human rights, as Ian will get into in a few minutes, in terms of human slavery on ships. It's an environmental issue. It's an issue that impacts sovereignty of countries. It impacts economic development. So at the same time, you might see huge programs happening to lift up populations in countries on economic development, but then on the opposite side, you have illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, which is undermining those development activities. It's also a security issue. As Admiral Fowler mentioned, it's in the top 3 security issues that every country with a coastline mentions, along with cybersecurity and countering transnational criminal networks. And then it's a global issue. So no one country can go it alone. We have to address it regionally. We have to address it globally. The good news is that we have the tools to do that. And it's a combination of tools. And so many of the people on this call, and we had over 1,000 people sign up in advance for the IUU piece of this conference, which gives you some idea of the magnitude of interest across this issue. We have a range of tools to do that. This issue's been working on for decades. So what's happened now to get this level of interest? You know, for those on the screen who work in foreign policy, sometimes there's a world event that happens that is that spark that really ignites captures the imagination of the world, and you can make enormous progress on a longstanding policy issue in a short amount of time. And that's what happened with illegal fishing. So last March, we all watched, the world watched, as the 350 plus vessels, sponsored by the Chinese government, subsidized by their government, showed up off the coast of the Galapagos Islands, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We all watched that online. And that was the trigger of seeing vessels with nets that span 3 to 4 football fields in length, the images of those nets scraping the bottom of the ocean, the pictures of capturing the whales, clipping their fins, and then throwing the body of the whales back in the ocean because the fin is the valuable part. It was that trigger of the Galapagos Islands because people can relate to it. People can picture the biodiversity that exists there and don't want to see it damaged. But there's the same type of fishing that's happening off the coast of Africa, that's happening off the coast of Asia, that's happening off the coast of Argentina, that's happening off the coast of Costa Rica. But it was that galvanizing event off the Galapagos Islands that really allowed us to leverage not only the full power of the interagency of the United States, but our regional and global partners. And so what's happened since then? We have the Commandant of the Coast Guard here, Admiral Schultz. They launched their global strategy to combat illegal fishing, and he'll go into that. We have Ian Urbina, world-renowned journalist. There's nobody better at documenting the illegal fishing, human slavery on ships. You have thousands of people across NGOs, across other groups, countries, governments, fisheries, who have been laboring away, waiting for this moment. So now you have the WTO. They're involved in trying to put a stop to subsidies that are currently for the illegal fishing business that are on track. They had a deadline of 2020 to get those subsidies taken out. They did not meet that deadline. They're back at the table this year. How can we make this year the year that subsidies go away for illegal fishing? You have technology that's online. So later today, we'll have the president of Global Fishing Watch really leading the way on technology. That technology democratizes information. And what do I mean by that? As Admiral Fowler referenced the AIS system, which is the GPS for ships, you can now see when vessels turn that off in real time. And you think of the power of that. You know that vessel by name, you know when they turn it off, and you know what you can do with that. And so we were able to see those 350 plus vessels when they turn those devices off and for how long, and share that information with governments such as Ecuador and Peru. And so there's a number of things in this space, the Coast Guard, the technology, the awareness. Where is all this headed? In my view, it's headed to the transparency and traceability of the seafood industry. And that involves a range of people, everybody from NGOs to governments to the private sector. For those of us who think back to the textile industry of the 90s, when you had the sweatshops globally, and what happened to really move the industry to traceability of the textile industry. It's those same steps that you're going to see in the seafood industry. Citizens demanding accountability, demanding traceability for seafood. Companies taking those positive steps to respond and take control of the supply chain of the seafood industry. And everybody has a role to play. And so one of the biggest strengths is really how we bring together all of those disparate pieces to really make movement on this policy and on the objective to reduce illegal fishing, but also get at food sustainability, security, economic development. And I'll just give you, one quick story from my days in El Salvador. I remember going to this small fishing village in Los Cobanos on the coast. And you go there and there's, all these fishing boats, these pangas as they're called, sitting up on the coastline. And the fishermen are just sitting there. So I go over, start talking to them, in particular, one of them, Mario. I said, Mario, what's happening? He says, well, we don't go out to fish because there are no more fish. And what are you doing? Well, we don't have an income. So we're trying to figure out what we can do to support our families. Mario's story represents coastlines across Asia, coastlines across Africa, coastlines across the Western Hemisphere. You have generations of fishermen and women who no longer have a livelihood. And that is largely due to not taking action on illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And so there's a whole range of things you're going to hear today about action, about how we can do that, including a very exciting development just this last month as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, known as the NDAA in defense worlds, where there was an inclusion of the establishment at the White House of a committee on the ocean. And so that really is going to be a galvanizing force to bring people together in the United States and then regionally and globally. So it's definitely one where we have this moment in history where we can make a lot of progress in a short amount of time, leveraging the many experts who have dedicated their lives to making progress on this issue. So look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel, and then we'll peel off from the global event and we'll spend the next 4 hours on addressing this issue. So back to you, President Solis. President Solis, you're on mute.
Nope, you're still
Still no audio.
There you go. Have to get used to this technology all the time. Thank you, Ambassador Maines. Ambassador Maines is the Civilian Deputy to the Commander and Foreign Policy Advisor at U.S. Southern Command. And now it is my pleasure to provide the floor to Mr. Ian Urbina, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, and as Ambassador Maines mentioned, one of the foremost defenders of human rights in the high seas. Ian, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. President, Madam Ambassador, Admiral Schultz, other panelists. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground in my 7 to 10 minutes, so forgive me if I move quickly. By way of introduction, for the last 7 years, I've been working on a sort of thematic focus of crimes at sea around the world under the auspices of a project called the Outlaw Ocean Project. And this looks at environmental, labor, and human rights abuses offshore globally. And there are two things that I wanted to do on the broadest level in terms of trying to set some context here, and ideally sort of stoke a general sense of urgency among those who are attending. One is to sort of help frame conceptually the planet and the 2/3 of the planet that is water, and sort of in a metaphoric sense, broaden our camera lens on it so that we think of it, in my view, in the proper frame. So if you think of the planet and its watery 2/3 as a living organism, I think that the ocean is best thought of in 4 metaphors, biological metaphors. In one sense, it is the circulatory system of this living biosphere we are on. Economically, it is the circulatory system. So 90% of things we consume, from iPhones to shoes to everything, grain and oil, travels by way of sea. And so the importance to the world economy of the health and governance of this space is essential. Number 2, it is, environmentally speaking, the lungs of the planet. So 50% of the oxygen we breathe comes from this water, right? And so pollution that hinders the ability of that organ, if you will, to produce that, to carry out that service, is of dire consequence to us as living members on the planet. The third is, I think, it is the heart in some ways. If you think of the heart as a workplace, right? It's an engine, a biological engine. And I think this is perhaps the part of the ocean that's forgotten most. It's key to remember that 56 million people work at sea. It's It's a striking number, and most of those people are unseen and unheard of. A lot of them are migrant, often undocumented, very typically from undeveloped or global south countries, and very invisible and therefore very vulnerable. So viewing this space as a workplace, as an engine of the organ, is key, because that helps you focus on what allows that productivity to occur, whether it's merchant marine carrying stuff, or distant water fishing vessels or near water fishing vessels pulling protein sources out of the water, right? And then the last one is the stomach. The ocean is in some ways the stomach, in the sense that huge portions, in some places 50% of the protein source that countries are deriving for their subsistence is coming by way of seafood. And so as those stocks disappear, as they're polluted, as they're overfished and taken abroad, that jeopardizes the food security and health of those nations. All right. So I think, like, at least in my own head, thinking about the space broadly in that way helps you understand why it matters, right? In a global sense. The other thing I would say, at least one of my agendas journalistically is to expand the spectrum or the taxonomy of what people think of when they think of illegality at sea. So IUU is a really great and smart, broad term that encompasses legal but overfishing all the way over to illegal fishing and unreported fishing. So I think it's really important, but I would go even broader. I would say it's really key to think of the wide spectrum of other types of crimes that are happening out there, because invariably they're connected with these illegal fishing. Most of the acute crimes are happening in the fishing sector, more so than the merchant marine. There are problems with merchant vessels, and I'll go into those in a second, but the acute crimes are largely happening in the fishing sector. And those crimes, understanding the diversity is, I think, key to understanding the urgency of the need for governance. So by diversity, I mean murder of stowaways. I mean the problem of sea slavery, which is captive and forced and debt bonded labor around the world. The problem not of oil spills, but of oil dumping. Every 3 years, ships intentionally dump more oil in the oceans than the BP and the Exxon Valdez spills combined. The problem or instability caused by repo men at sea, and maritime thievery that's often at the behest of large insurers or banks, a serious destabilizing effect. The problem of, and this is, again, I'm intentionally excluding IUU for a moment, the problem of illegal whaling. The problem of seafarer abandonment, a huge issue in the COVID moment, where tens of thousands of workers are simply left stranded on ships around the world because their owners have decided to cut their losses and turn the other way. And these individuals are stuck and have no way to get home. These are all the problem of murder caught on camera. I mean, this was a piece that we put on the front page of the Washington Post 2 months ago, and on the front of the New York Times 4 years ago. And just on Friday, the captain, 7 years after the murder was filmed on camera, was sentenced in Taiwan to 26 years. But this was a documented case of mass murder. 4 individuals filmed as they were murdered at sea, and then the culprits posed for selfies celebrating it afterwards. It took 7 years of pressure to get a prosecution in that case. So these problems all connect to IUU because illegalities are intertwined, whether it's drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, or these other things I've mentioned, are often sitting on a basis of tax evasion, bribery, document fraud. And so it's really key, I think, to always be thinking about IUU as it's connected to all these other crimes. I'll briefly, I'm at 7 minutes now. In 2 minutes, I'll briefly touch on 2 stories that illustrate, I think, 2 recent stories we reported that illustrate some of these issues. The discovery of the largest illegal fishing fleet ever happened with great help from a team of academics, Global Fishing Watch, and my team at the Outlaw Ocean Project. And it was 900 to 1,000 vessels that were squid vessels, Chinese squid vessels, that we discovered fishing in North Korean waters. These vessels are in North Korean waters, even though China had signed the 2017 sanctions on North Korea, which explicitly forbid any foreign fishing in those waters as a method to pressure the North Koreans to stop with their nuclear testing. And yet 1/3 of the distant water fishing fleet of China was parked in North Korean waters and fishing for squid. Hugely destabilizing for North Korean population in causing, and Japanese and South Korean populations, causing an 80% decline in that squid stock, but also really undermining of the very mechanisms of international law and UN treaties, of which the US was a signatory. That was a unanimous Security Council agreement to put sanctions. And if one of the signatories is blatantly defying those sanctions, then what's the point of imposing them in the first place? So here's a perfect example where you have a massive case of IUU, well documented. We went out on the water, filmed them, have the satellite information, and not a huge amount of outcry and reaction, but very undermining to international law. The other sort of more micro example I'd cite is a story that's coming out in a couple of weeks in the New Yorker, which was based on reporting that we did off the coast of Gambia. And it was a look, again, not to beat up on the Chinese, because there are a lot of players out there engaged in IUU, but the Chinese are by far the biggest. But this was a case where we looked at fish meal, which is this protein source of ground up fish pulled from the oceans, ground up and then fed to farmed fish and pigs and chickens. And this fleet of ships that were near West Africa, Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, were raking the oceans of various types of fish, including bonga, which is this subsistence fish, which for decades, if not centuries, has allowed West Africans to survive. Bonga were so plentiful a decade ago that you would get them free at the market. And now they're so hard to get and priced out for the locals because they're all going to these fish meal plants, which get shipped back to China and then get sent to the EU, the US, Norway to be fed to salmon and shrimp farms. So the global supply chain is complicit in the overfishing problems that are destabilizing places like Gambia. You have a newly democratic government there that's attempting to sort of break the past repressive government and open up things democratically, but you have youth protests who are frustrated with the Chinese pollution and overfishing, and now you have the local government repressing those protests in a way that's starting to look like the old regime. And that's all to protect foreign investment, in this case Chinese, and all to protect this sort of IUU really unhealthy cycle. So this is an example of a place where you have destabilizing both food security and geopolitical and democratic consequences of IUU. I'll end my comments there.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this portray of how complex this issue is. And now I give the floor to Admiral Carl Schultz, who is the 26th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. Admiral Schultz, you've got the floor, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to participate today and offer the Coast Guard's perspective on this challenge of IUUF fishing. And Admiral Fowler and Ambassador Maines and Ian, you really framed the topic well. So I'm gonna offer a little bit of perspective from how the United States Coast Guard looks into this. President Solis, good to see you, sir. And I'm really hoping this is the start of many conversations on this important topic. And I think the Coast Guard is right in the thick of moving forward here. You know, the service that I have the privilege of leading here has been at this game for 230 years, representing American interests around the globe. And our global operations and partnerships really advance our United States national security strategy, which is focused on upholding rules-based order. And we're focused on strengthening partner capacity in this domain. As Admiral Fowler knows, we've been at it for the good part of 4 decades in the Southcom area, thwarting transnational criminals, moving illicit narcotics. And we're really about facilitating the free flow of commerce across the globe. Coast Guard men and women are operating today, every day, around the globe, modeling acceptable maritime behaviors in a transparent manner, working alongside partner Coast Guards, partner navies, maritime security forces who share that commitment to upholding and bolstering what we call maritime safety and security, and really, ultimately, the rule of law. Our Coast Guard, United States Coast Guard, believes we influence others, not with a domineering spirit, but by reinforcing that rules-based system that promotes peace, security, prosperity, and the sovereignty of all nations. Unfortunately, some nations lack the moral conscience to patrol their own sovereign waters, police their fleets, including their distant water fleets, which you've heard a lot about from the former speakers, and apprehend and prosecute transgressors. This lack of shared responsibility really creates tremendous opportunities for exploitation, and that is the subject of IUU fishing. IUU fishing presents more than just a direct threat to the sustainable management of marine resources. And Ian really accentuated those threats, but it's global food security, it's ocean ecosystems, it's economic security, and the national security and sovereign interests of coastal states, particularly small coastal states. IUU fishing, when supported as a de facto state policy that disregards the maritime rules-based order, presents a significant crack in the infrastructure of global norms and the collective good governance that we've relied upon as a global society for a good part of the last century. IUU fishing, and I'm not sure this is fact-based, but I think Craig Fowler and Gene talked about it's in the top 3 threats. In my mind, from what I sense across the globe, is really one of the top issues, replacing piracy in global maritime security threat forefront. IUU fishing is a worldwide threat, and I think that's indisputable. And if IUU fishing continues unchecked, we can expect a deterioration of fragile coastal states and increased tensions across the globe among foreign fishing nations. And that threatens geographic stability around the globe. As the only agency, and maybe this is a bold statement, but really maybe one of the lead agencies that have the operational capabilities, the supporting infrastructure, and the statutory authorities existing today to project law enforcement presence across our own exclusive economic zone and across key areas on the high seas. I think the U.S. Coast Guard is uniquely positioned to combat this IUU fishing threat and uphold the rule of law. You know, at-sea enforcement of living marine resources is an enduring Coast Guard mission. And as mentioned by a couple folks, we put out a strategic outlook, which is really a 10-year vision. And I'll just hold this up here. And if you're interested in it, you can find it online. Challenging my technical skills here, but if you go to www.uscg.mil for mil /IUUF fishing, so IUU fishing slant bar, you can pull the product down, and that is really our look into the next decade about how we're going to tackle this problem. There's 3 lines of effort that are accentuated in this strategic outlook. Number 1, promote targeted, effective, intelligence-driven enforcement operations. Number 2, counter predatory and irresponsible state behaviors. And number 3, expand multilateral fisheries cooperation. Again, this is a product written for the Coast Guard of how we bring our capabilities and our capacity into this global fight. We know there are many partners already hard at work out there, tirelessly working to tackle this threat. And we applaud your efforts. And we recognize that none of us can work this problem alone. Meeting the challenge head on is going to require forthright engagement, really recognizing the true strategic implications of the IUU threat. And I think Ian really teased that out extremely in a candid, forthright fashion. It's going to require new global commitments to transparency and a collective management on the high seas to what I call illuminate or shine the light on the shadows. And it's really in the shadows where much of this IUU fishing behavior and the bad actors operate and reside. It'll require the innovative use of intelligence, technology, analytic capabilities for data, big data, and information sharing to identify, target, and interdict illicit actors and disrupt their corrupt cycles that influence and enable these illegal operations. It'll require the United States to build cooperative networks with key partners, both old and new. And some partners themselves will be innovative, as we'll need to increasingly look to engage non-governmental organizations, academia, and industry partners at a level we haven't done before. These new allies will help us think outside of our traditional boxes, our traditional military thinking, including how we distribute information and intelligence to the widest audience possible. It's going to require us to increase operational commitments, seek operational commitments from partners, like-minded partners. And it's going to require for us to build the capabilities of partners that don't have those skills and those assets today. Lastly, it'll require a strong, united response to those nation states and continue to get after those that engage in predatory behaviors. You know, those that engage in such behaviors disregard global norms, and they disregard responsible and respectful use of marine resources. And in this, I see tremendous opportunity. At sea enforcement of living marine resources, it is an enduring Coast Guard mission, as I mentioned before, and we excel at building human-to-human relationships and combating tough problems. And it has my and the entire service's top commitment. So playing to these strengths, let me wrap up by saying that I'm confident We will galvanize a coalition to confront coercive and antagonistic activity head on. And we're going to work hard to uphold our shared peaceful and humanitarian values. So together, let's get after this. Let's strengthen global maritime security. Through that, we build regional stability, and ultimately, it's about economic prosperity for ourselves. And as Ambassador Maines and Admiral Fowler talked about, our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere, close to home. This is really about economic prosperity and security in the region. So thanks so much. I look forward to the continued conversations and questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral Schultz. And now we're going to get into the discussion, the conversation on this very complex issue. Now, we're talking about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, what's called IUUF. Now, this is bad enough regarding the illegal part of the concept. But what I gather from what you have been saying is that illegality in fishing and activities related to fishing is probably the easiest part to deal with this issue. I mean, the bigger problem comes not with the illegal fishing, which has its own normative and it can be handled somehow, but with the unreported and unregulated part of it. And a couple of you have mentioned the associations between that part of illegal fishing. Of the concept of unregulated, unreported fishing, and the legitimate business practices. Can you please explain a little bit how that takes place? How is it that the private sector inadvertently or in complicity participate in this in this field? I don't know who want to take it. Maybe Ian, do you want to begin with it?
Sure, I can tackle that. So if you think of global supply chains, right, the means by which we get the stuff we consume, be it food or oil or Nike shoes, these are increasingly complicated and long chains where there's a handoff between many players of the goods, right? And the offshore space, the marine maritime space, is distinct in the sense that a huge portion of that chain, namely from the dock to the bait, to the hook in the seafood sector, is largely invisible to both consumers, to corporate players, to insurers. That's not necessarily the case, as Ambassador Maines pointed out. There's really promising technology, both big data, algorithmic, sort of blockchain type supply chain technology on computers for tracking goods, as well as up in the sky satellite monitoring technology that, if leveraged and if there's the political will, both on the government level, but quite importantly on the corporate level, that chain can become much more seeable. But the nature of how things move at sea, the fact that the vessels are not like factories on land, they're moving from one port to another port. They're often captained by someone from one country, owned by someone from another country, flagged to a third country. The workers on board might be undocumented or documented, but they're typically from a fourth country, and they're traveling from a port in a fifth over to a port in a sixth, right? So you have this transient, opaque workforce, and that makes it even tougher to keep track of what's going on. Add to the mix the problem of transshipment, which is this situation in which fish is offloaded at sea, so not brought into port where there are inspectors with clipboards and you can start tracking the stuff, but rather they're moved from 1 or 10 fishing vessels onto a mothership, mixed together, and then that mothership, it comes back to shore. Well, in the mothership's cargo, or fish hold, you will have a mixture of fish coming off vessels that are engaged in sea slavery and fish coming off vessels that are upright standing players. And that makes it even tougher for those few companies that do want to ensure they're not complicit in these problems to actually accomplish that. So these are some of the reasons why legal players end up wittingly or unwittingly getting mixed up with illegal activities.
Thank you, Ian. Ambassador Maines, I would like your take on this issue, particularly in what pertains cooperation among states. We have several questions now and asking for this. How is it that it is possible to get more cooperation from local authorities where some of these fish of these boats are either registered or they dock for resupplying and other things? Do you think that approaching this from the national perspective from the state perspective and international cooperation can help in controlling some of this these activities?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of different angles, as Ian points out. There's the supply chain angle, which again, I'm a big believer in the court of public opinion. And so where the consumer really decides to pressure an industry to do the right thing, that happened with the textile industry in the 90s, where companies really said, we don't control our supply chain, the sweatshops across the world, we don't know who they are, they're not related to us, we have no responsibility. And then consumers really took that and said, well, you do. And by the way, we're not going to buy your products until you figure it out and you figure out how to manage your supply chain and have responsibility for it. That's really where we're headed in the seafood industry. And it absolutely requires the cooperation across country because the fish don't know any boundaries. But the beauty about this issue, unlike narco trafficking, where the narco traffickers adjust to where you patrol, the fishing vessels follow the migration patterns of the fish. So you can actually use the big data, the analytical capability that Ian was referencing by previous years and project where those vessels are going to be. For example, those same vessels, those same 350 plus vessels we saw last March, guess what? They're on the way back to the Galapagos Islands as we speak. Why? Because they're following the fish migratory patterns. So you have to have cooperation across the countries. And what we saw after the Galapagos incident started last March is agreements with Peru, with Colombia, with Costa Rica, with Ecuador, all joining together because no one country can go after this. And to Ian's point, you have two issues. You have those big floating cities that can operate almost, unilaterally outside the coastal waters. And then you have those that have to come in for resupply. And so that's working with governments on maritime port security, identifying vessels through tracking who's turned off their AIS systems, because then they're more likely to have illegally fished if they have turned off those AIS, those GPS for ships, getting shipwriter agreements, getting tracking, and then starting to close the areas that are allowing those vessels to come into port and sort of closing off one by one those areas where vessels known to have engaged in this activity cannot find safe harbor. And then you start to close the gaps one by one.
Thank you, Ambassador. Admiral Schultz, there are a number of questions regarding transponders precisely, and how can you control that? And if this would be a very important tool to put an end to some of these activities. I mean, ADSs, that whole issue, how is it handled? I mean, we are now dealing with some organized activities, organized crime activity, transnational organized activities, and also opportunistic crime. What's your take on the way to control these activities through technology and the new technologies you have access to?
Yeah, thanks, President Solis. So that's a great question. And there's a big piece of that. We've heard many folks already speak about folks turning off their AIS. That's a tracking, that's a transponder system. So if that system is used properly and by its design, it comes out of the UN, International Maritime Organization, as a requirement. When trackers are on, you can track behavior. You can see what's going on. We've heard indicators of this fleet operating off of South America, West and East Coast, high propensity to turn it off, which probably points to illicit activity. We see that off the West Coast of Africa, in some cases up to 80% of vessels are operating without their AS on board. So there's a big data piece. This is where we need to bring in NGOs and other organizations that have been working at this in the international space for many years, and they have the visibility, the technology to see this. We've got a link our governmental efforts to these NGOs and academic and private interests to figure out how to work the big data analytics and see this. When you see it, then you have to have an enforcement piece. You have to go out there and actually show the ability to illuminate the bad actors. You know, Gene Maines, the ambassador, talked about the Ecuador, the 350 vessels off the Galapagos Marine Reserve. So a coastal nation like Ecuador with some naval and Coast Guard capabilities, but not a lot. You know, they sent a boat out there, but they had a hard time even getting amidst the 350 Chinese flagged or Chinese characteristic vessels that may be under some South American flags through usually less than, you know, transparent behaviors, how that all resolves. We sent a national security cutter down there, the Coast Guard cutter Berthoff, and for about 3 days, they operated with an Ecuadorian naval vessel, and we used a Scan Eagle unmanned aerial capability to fly around the fleet, and we could correlate who was, you know, transponding or showing an AIS signal, who wasn't, and we turned over information on a dozen plus vessels to the Ecuadorians to say, hey, here's some of the illicit actors out here, we think, and how do you get after that? So it's seeing the information and understanding and cranking it through sort of big data analytics. Then it's applying some enforcement capabilities to go out there and act against that. And then it's calling out flag state behavior. That Chinese fleet, think about it. That's 9,000 miles plus or minus from China to the west coast of South America. You know, what the United States government contends is that we need to be responsible flag states. So for the US, these distant water fleet, we regulate them. We monitor their behaviors. You think about fish in the United States, 80% of the fish we consume is imported. But we have an active process here, active laws, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Management Act, the Lacey Act. We hold our US fishermen accountable on how they behave and operate in our US waters. Our waters are still pretty, robust and good fishing grounds. You look at places such as the South China Sea, where nearshore waters have basically been ravaged. The artisanal fishermen have no means of income. President Xi Jinping says, hey, build bigger boats and go further offshore. This is the challenge. It's these, tens of thousands of distant water fleets without flag state oversight moving around, as Ambassador Maines talked about. It's a tough problem set. So we've got to really see the problem, what I call maritime domain awareness of the domain, and then put enforcement actions against that. We have some capability in the Coast Guard. Some of the world's navies do. They're also dealing with a lot of other threat vectors. It's about capacity building. Look, we talk a lot about Western Hem. Look at Oceania, small island nations where more than 50% of their gross domestic product comes from the sea. We got to work with them. You need to see more Coast Guard, more United States Coast Guard in the Indo-Pacific region, doing personnel, human-to-human transfers, building capacity, helping them think about how they get after, their sovereign waters. And one last word on that, President, as you know, we sent a couple excess defense article Coast Guard cutters to Costa Rica, 2 through the DOD excess defense article process, 1 through State Department INL. And those ships are really, doing great work interdicting illicit narcotics, but they're also starting to look at how do you protect the Costa Rican EEZ from illicit IUU fishing. So I think it's a collaborative effort, seeing the problem, enforcing actions against it. And then when you find bad actors, flag states need to take behaviors and hold folks accountable through civil penalty, through other legal actions.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for that. May I ask you a following question about you, because you've mentioned that IUUF is a national security threat, and you're looking at it from that angle. Have you been able to establish a direct link between criminal activities and distant water fishing fleets? Is there somehow a coordinated, or are there links between the two? This very large fleets from different countries, being China the largest, having China the largest fleet in terms of crime, of transnational organized crime?
President, I think there's clear linkages. Ian spoke very artfully about, as you push these fleets further offshore, there's less visibility, less transparency. It's an invisible workforce. So, I think the human trafficking, the human slavery, we've heard the horror stories, we've read the horror stories in National Geographic, other places. That goes on. In terms of other illicit behaviors, I think what we see is that story that Ambassador Maines talked about, Mario. Mario, a displaced artisanal fisherman in El Salvador. Now he's looking for work to support his family. You look at the drug trade that comes out of the Indian Ridge, which, transits along the coast of the Central American corridor. That artisanal fisherman who's got a family to feed might end up being a drug smuggler, moving cocaine out of the Andean Ridge up into Mexico for ultimate destination to American streets. So there are clear linkages between, transnational criminal activity. I would say not every distant water fisherman is illicit. There is legal distant water fishing. It's when you have the large scale operations, less than transparent with AIS off. And the AIS is off because they're essentially going into coastal states with limited enforcement capabilities and, fishing in their EEZs. That's when this thing goes off the rails. So I think there's a clear tie to other bad behaviors, whether it's transnational criminals or not. I think you can argue all sides of that. But when you look at this threat, IUU fishing, it's about the 6th largest, illicit activity on the global scale here. So it's a big deal in terms of revenue. Somewhere between 15 and $36 billion of illicit activity is skimmed off in IUF activity on an annual basis.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to bring in a couple of questions from our audience. Julian Engel says that it was stated twice that people don't share values and understanding of the importance of marine resources, and he would like to question the statements, as most people involved in IUU fishing are lacking alternatives. It is important to differentiate between the operators and the people who benefit from these practices, he says. And then Jackie Jamshid, who's a doctoral business student here at FIU, makes a question: what are your thoughts on fish certified sustainable, quote unquote, that have illegal catch, that it is mixed? Is there any way to decouple the two? And clearly one way, which Ambassador Maines suggests, this is traceability. I would like Ian, Ambassador Maines, to address these two issues. The understanding of marine resources in the general public and this issue of sustainable fishing, if you please. Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first comment to make a really good point. I think that it's really key to focus on not the outlook or character of the players as much as the systems within which they're operating. So by that, I mean, first of all, the real folks who are benefiting from these crimes tend to be not on the water, right? They're on land and they're in offices. And these are the manning agencies that are engaging in human trafficking. These are the fishing companies that are really reaping the profits. Most of the true beneficiaries of these crimes who are on the true participants of the crimes who are on the water are either unwitting. So for example, the crews on these ships have no say typically as to where they're going. That's up to the officers. And the officers, even themselves, and the captains are often under pretty intense pressure due to both from the corporate level and also just from the sort of small margins that are involved in fishing. So these are fairly poor operators. So that's key. But the other thing is, I think it's really important to be thinking about, again, the diversity of crimes here. So on the earlier comment about IUU's ties to other types of crimes, some of these are not so sexy and glamorous, but think of tax evasion, bribery, document fraud, money and fish laundering. Okay, these are not like really exciting, dramatic crimes, but they're hugely consequential when it comes to the stability of a nation, their ability to take revenue from their resources and actually channel them toward development within their countries. If those spoils are being diverted through document fraud and tax evasion and corruption and bribery towards individual pockets and away from the public at large, that's how sort of poverty cycles are maintained. And political instability is worsened. And so IUU has a direct connection to those sorts of crimes, not to mention the more, murder and slavery and these sorts of things. The other thing I would also rush to point out is a diversity of other sorts of crimes that aren't just incursions into places where ships aren't supposed to go, as is the case in the Galapagos. So here I'm thinking of, let's not forget shark finning. Let's not forget the problem of bycatch, meaning all sorts of fish that are caught inadvertently and thrown overboard. Even if you're not super sentimental about fish, the oceans are running out of fish, and to a large degree because of these sorts of crimes, bycatch, the wrong gear being used, nets that are too thin that are catching juveniles, and the stocks collapse that much faster. So these are crimes that don't show up on satellite and don't involve crossing into Ecuadorian waters, but they are serious overfishing crimes that are driving the depletion. And these are crimes for which the solutions tend to be other things like onboard cameras, at sea inspections, tightening the grid of port state inspections, ports in various countries that are working in collaboration to better inspect the catch when it comes. And so these are some of the other ways that we can solve these other types of crimes as well. But again, none of these crimes have to do with the character of the people involved. And most of these crimes benefit the guys and women on shore more so than the people at sea.
Thank you, Ian. Ambassador Maines?
So to follow up on Ian's point, when you look at similar illegal activity, whether it's narco trafficking, you can go after the guy who you find on the street corner, or you can go after the network and the finances. Now, you have to go after the guy on the street, but that's really not where the game has changed. The game is changed by identifying and going after the network of all those people involved in the chain that Ian mentioned, finding the money, because that's really the motivating factor, which is why it's so important to get that passed through the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to end the subsidies for illegal fishing, because that is making it financially attractive to engage in illegal activity. So there are a number of areas that you can start to go after, not just the ones that maybe we've referenced in terms of the satellite activity, identifying the ships, but that goes back to a point that Admiral Schultz made about the state sponsor monitoring of your deep water fleet. So if you have a large deep water fleet, then it is the responsibility of a country to monitor that. That includes where they're going, their AIS systems, the type of gear that Ian referenced that they're using, the type of employment that is on those vessels. So all of those things, again, if you're a responsible international player, your first look should be to your own deep water fleet and how to get your own house in order, and then move out from there. In terms of the sustainability piece, I always believe in the power of the consumer to drive change. And so I'm a big believer, frankly, in having consumers have the information to make an informed choice about where they're getting their products, whether that is an issue that we all know from the blood diamond issue, or the textile industry, or the seafood industry. Forcing traceability in the supply chain. We have the technology, we have the innovation, we have those efforts. It needs that push and incentive to be able to get there.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, while you have the floor, there is a question by Cynthia Marcial, who's reaching us from Buenos Aires, Argentina, asking, have you considered cooperative alliances in international riverine scenarios, like the Hidrovía Paraná-Paraguay, close to the Atlantic Ocean? And she's really happy about the conference. Thank you, Cynthia. What do we have in terms of specific cooperation in riverine scenarios, which are very much tied to maritime issues in big river situations like the Paraná or the Nile or other big ones in the world, around the world?
Hi, Cynthia. I think you raised a really good point. As we're expanding our cooperation, the importance of the Coast Guard global strategy cannot be overstated, because it really sets the framework for what we're able to do across a range of efforts. So for example, we have an ongoing operation with the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Stone that's in a number of countries, including a stop in Montevideo, where there's a number of things happening of vessels going into the port of Montevideo. As we ramp up regional and international cooperation, there is a lot we can do in this space. And I think countries are so eager to work on it, because again, it goes back to each country sees this as a national security threat, as a sovereignty threat, and then a threat to economic prosperity. And so we have a shared interest. And so to the best of our ability, we are working with those partners, building up those relationships to get at just what you mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Admiral Schultz, there's a question directly to you from Mr. Rodrigo Lázaro. And the question is that if you think that the laws of the sea are sort of out of date in order to better address IUU issues? Which are the responsibilities of some international organizations, as the International Maritime Organization, to support nations to address IUU? And Antonio Porras from my own Costa Rica thinks that it is very important to work with regional organizations dealing with with fishing issues, and also would like to know if there is an effort being done in that sense, not only with the policing agencies but also with NGOs. Admiral Schultz.
There's a lot in that question, and absolutely, regional fishery management organizations are at the heart of this. They set the guidelines, the regulations for various parts of the world, Western Central Pacific fisheries, regional management. We work hand in glove with them, but then there has to be that enforcement piece. We've seen some examples, when collaboration, North Pacific Coast Guard Forum stood up years back, Russia, South Korea, Japan, Canada. High seas drift nets were, those are miles of nets behind vessels ravaging the ocean, all kinds of bycatch that gets killed in the process. UN sanctions came out against high seas drift netting years back. And with a collaborative effort, we drove high seas drift net fishing down to very small numbers now. And there's some successes, some examples of success. Ambassador Maines, talked about Argentina here a little bit from the last question. And the National Security Cutter Stone on its maiden voyage, our ninth National Security Cutter. We haven't had a cutter off the east coast of Latin America, South America here in more than a decade. But working with the Uruguayans, working with the Brazilians, we had some offers on the table to work with the Argentinians, and a little bit of a mixed reaction there from different parts of the government in terms of what they want to do and what they didn't want to do. And some of that ties to relationships with other great power competitors about buying arms and capabilities and port infrastructure. So there's a lot of things here, but it is back to the question. It's about, international standards and norms. It is about, we have about 60 bilateral, multilateral arrangements around the globe where the United States Coast Guard works with different countries. Many of them stem from the counter-narcotics threats, but going back, some are based on fisheries. It's broadening those and making sure we have the ability to work bilaterally, multilaterally. But really, I think the question is at the heart of this. We've got to do this through collaborative fashion. We got to build these networks. And the question, I think, linked to NGOs, again, we don't have the capacity to see this problem on our own, but we can bring in the efforts of others. You look at how some of these NGOs have worked with the EU, and the EU is an example of a focused effort against IUU fishing. You can drive to some positive outcomes. So I'll leave the answer there, President Solis.
Thank you. There's another question for you. Let me read it to you as you have the floor. This is from Osvaldo Rosero. He says that he has read the recent proposal about boarding and inspection on high seas that the U.S. presented in the recent SPRFMO. These acronyms drive me crazy. Meeting last week. Do you have a timeline expectation about obtaining consensus on this approval, sir?
I do not have the question. I think he's talking about the South Pacific Regional Management Fishery Organization. I don't have that with me, President Solis here. We can probably run that to ground if someone wants to follow back with FIU there. We could probably get you an answer on that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Ambassador Maines, does the United States have any chance of becoming a member of the UNCLOS community? Would that enhance the possibilities of law enforcement in the commons? This is a question from Cesar Recalde.
I think there are many opportunities coming up. We have a new U.S. administration, and looking at the issues of human rights, of sustainability, of the environment, all those issues. Now with the new Oceans Committee at the White House, you have 22 U.S. government agencies or offices that are involved in this issue. And so I think there are many opportunities for the U.S. to step up, to lead, and to play an even bigger role. But you have seen, in fact, a lot of progress leveraging the efforts of many people on this call who have dedicated their entire lives to pursuing this over the last 10 months. And again, I go back to the Galapagos as that spark that really has ignited a global movement to try and get at the fundamental issues surrounding IUU.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ian, there's a question about the vulnerabilities of the fishing industry. What makes fishing vessels and fishermen susceptible to engagement in criminal activities or involved in violent actions in the high seas?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors, so I'll just try to quickly run through them. Ambassador Maines mentioned subsidies. Again, not another dramatic or riveting topic that you can get editors or people interested in easily, but super consequential in that it's government's funneling money into an industry that directly contributes to overcapacity, plainly stated, too many boats on the water. And that stokes competition between the boats, that stokes overfishing from the boats, that stokes illegal behavior because of the competition from the boats, using different types of nets and such, going places they shouldn't. So all of that makes unhealthy competition in the marketplace and is really detrimental to the oceans, to the economy, et cetera. So, sorry, did you want to jump in, President?
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think the other key factor, if we're talking about vulnerability of the fishers, of those who work these vessels, because fishing in general is a industry that is not super lucrative. It's got very tight margins, especially the further down the production chain you get, i.e. down to the boat level. The reality is with 40% of your typical cost being labor on any boat, that is the one place where you can cut corners and make a little bit more money. And that's often the driver toward the use of migrant workers. That's the driver towards the use of what we would certainly call unethical, but in many places illegal contracts that put workers in debt even before they get on the boat. These are the drivers of that. So I would just cite those two factors for now.
Thank you. There's another question for you, Ian, from Tariq Fayyaz, who's a PhD candidate at Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law in Kharagpur in India. And he asks about what are the prospects for the small scale fisheries community if the WTO subsidies are no longer there after 2021. The whole thing of subsidies remains a large issue in this matter, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and again, reporters don't know much, they know people that know much. And so, I'm not actually an expert. I just have a lot of smart sources. And the sources I turn to on subsidies and WTO tell me that indeed India is the player that is most acutely concerned about and pushing back on the drive to slow down subsidies, and for decent reasons, concerns for their own citizens and the vulnerability of these coastal communities that are relying somewhat on these subsidies to stay afloat. So there are real poverty and human concerns that have to be taken into consideration. Again, in the case of other trade agreements and subsidy kind of solutions, there have typically been embedded off-ramping kind of detox, if you will, methods that are built in to try to help those most vulnerable demographics and nations that are going to suffer most acutely. And from a negotiating standpoint, I think it makes sense for India and these sorts of nations to really push for those sorts of assistance by the developed nations to wean the country off of the subsidies. But it's not in the big picture and long game sense, it's not in the local fisheries interests to allow the subsidies to continue, because they might be helping keep those local fishers afloat, but they're also helping the industrial vessels coming from China pillage those same waters that will cause the very stocks to collapse. That'll put those guys in India out of business sooner anyway. So from a big picture point of view, the subsidies are going to tank those fish stocks in any case. And so it's not a sustainable plan for Indian perspective.
Thank you very much, Ian. Well, as it is always the case, we're running out of time, and we have a lot of other questions, very interesting ones that have been asked the panelists in our Q&A. I apologize for not having been able to accommodate all of them. I've tried to be as broad as I have been capable of. We have to close now, but before we'd like to know if Ambassador Maines or Admiral Schultz would like to have a wrapping up 1 minute intervention. Ian, you yourself as well, of course.
So just,
Ambassador Maines?
Just one wrap up on this. To that question on subsidies, you can't look at this issue in a vacuum. And so there are many other pieces of it in terms of sustainable development options, working with artisanal fisheries, looking at aquaculture, looking at a whole range of development issues at the same time that you are combating an illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So that would be, there are many players in this space, local NGOs, national, international, and it is that joining of efforts where we will be successful.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Admiral Schultz.
Yeah, President Solis, just on that subsidies topic, because it's drawn a lot of interest. You know, when you think about China, the worst violator of IUU fishing, and trawlers being the most common parts of their deep water fleet, you know, it's a fuel intensive operation, and research shows about 2/3 of those trawlers would prove unprofitable absent subsidies. So there's big conversation, the subsidies, and then there's some subsidies with our own fleet here that I think you do have to look at the you know, cradle to grave on subsidies writ large, and look into the, you know, the most egregious behaviors, but maybe not all behaviors. I think both the ambassador and Ian frame that well. You know, in closing, I'd say 3 key points. You know, IUU fishing undermines the sovereignty of coastal nations. It threatens the economic security. It threatens the global rules-based orders I talked about. And, you know, we, the Coast Guard, we're going to up our game from a leadership perspective. Again, we don't have Coast Guardsmen and Coast Guard vessels be the world's police on the water, but we think we can help build a network through human-to-human partnerships in international fora with key U.S. interests here. The Safe Act, which recently came into law, the Maritime Safe Act, that, as Ambassador Maines pointed to, it starts to tie together all the U.S. federal and agency interests that have a slice of this IUU fishing. So that's very encouraging coming out of our Congress recently. That's going to crystallize our U.S. government efforts. And again, a lot of these behaviors of IUU fishing are in the shadows, and it's about the domain awareness. It's about illuminating it. And through that network, we can get after this. So we're really excited to be part of the team that's going to get after this global scourge.
Thank you very much, Admiral Schultz. And with that, we will finish this panel. I would like to remind those who will continue with us in the conference on IUUF to stay tuned. You have a link that was sent to you this morning, and we're going to go on to the second session as of 10:30 this morning. The second panel is on socioeconomic, environmental, and security impacts of IUUF. So thank you so much to all of you who have participated in this as part of the State of the World Conference. Stay on. We have many exciting things coming along. And thank you very much. Enjoy the morning.
President Solis, if I may, thank you so much for moderating the session, and to the panel, outstanding and just a fascinating conversation. And we're very grateful to Southcom and our friends at the Gordon Institute for coming to us with this idea to kick off this third day of State of the World with this joint panel, if you will. And as Ambassador Solis said, for though I shouldn't be plugging this because we don't want to lose our viewers for State of the World, but I believe the link to register for the follow-on to your conference on IUU fishing is go.fiu.edu/IUUF conference. I hope I have that right. If you do go to that conference, come back when it ends. I think it's scheduled to end at 1:30. We'll still be going on here at State of the World with panels on restoring transatlantic relations and a conversation with the former Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun. We will be back, however, at 10:30, where we will talk about China more specifically beyond the issue of illegal fishing. Thanks again to this terrific panel, and we'll see all of you back here in 12 minutes. Thank you.
As a student who is interested in looking to go into politics in the future, having the experience of State of the World is one of the best things that we can get.
So at this event, we will see panelists throughout the 2 days from all walks of life. There are journalists, there are scholars, there are actual diplomats themselves, and they discuss prevalent issues to today's international communities.
Human trafficking is now part of the conversation.
Our original response on the 29th of December to their rocket attacks on us on the 27th of December was absolutely justifiable and right under international law.
I don't think that if you talk to any Democrat, they would tell you that impeachment was good politics for them.
This is an experience that students don't get on a daily basis, because despite the fact that you can learn a lot in classes and in lectures, you can't experience having a real-life policymaker, a real-life scientist there in front of you, explaining to you the intricacies of these foreign situations and conflicts.
you've assembled such an amazing group of people here that it's become this sort of meeting place early in the new year. So it's to really become the first conference of the new year.
State of the World proves that every concept we learn in poli-sci courses, in international relations courses, in any one of those social sciences, how they are applicable to real-day issues and events that we are seeing.
Hopefully when you leave here today, you'll be enabled to have an even louder voice than you already have.
I think you've really established something here at FIU that you should be very proud of.